verse 1, keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice to fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth, therefore let thy words be few. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. When thou vowest to God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better it is that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice, and destroy the work of thine hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities, but fear thou God. If thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all, for the king himself is served by the field. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. By those riches perish evil travail. And he begetteth nothing in his hand. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profiteth he that hath labored for the wind? All his days he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. Behold, that which I have seen is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. Well, here, just like much like chapter 4, Solomon kind of continuing these more practical exhortations, more so than he was in the beginning of the book. And so in the beginning of chapter 5, he turns to the topic of worship. And we know that it is worship because verse 1 makes this quite clear. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God. And so that's the context. And so worship is what Solomon is talking about here in the first 7 verses. And so in these first 7 verses, Solomon uses the word fool 3 times and then leads him to the stark truth that God hath no pleasure in fools. And so obviously he's saying with regards to our worship, we don't want to be foolish. But then we have to ask the question, who is the fool? Who is the one in whom God refuses to take pleasure? Specifically with regards to worship. This isn't just talking about the sinful man who has rejected God. These are talking about the ones at the house of God, the ones worshiping God. And yet God has labeled some of them fools. And these fools, he is taking no pleasure in them. And so, again, we ask, who is that in reference to? And so the fool is the one who speaks with unchecked words, the one who speaks more than they listen, thus they are approaching God frivolously. And that's kind of the point that Solomon is making here. They are doing, or rather saying things, both in their interactions with others and in their worship to God, that they are really not putting any heart into, no weight into, no meaning into. They're speaking and approaching and worshiping God in a frivolous manner. And so Solomon here is in complete agreement with Samuel in 1 when he said, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. And the word obey literally means to listen. Because obviously when we talk about obedience and listening, obedience is the natural conclusion of someone who's actually listening. We talk, with children all the time, and if they have not obeyed an instruction, we tell them you weren't listening, right? You weren't listening, and listening and obeying, they go hand in hand. And so Solomon here is speaking of the, and he turns to this topic of vows, and again, he's still relating this to worship. He speaks of the foolishness of making vows, and for one reason or another, failing to carry them out. Either you made the vow and forgot, or you made the vow and you were just unable to carry this out. And, of course, vow, means promise. And so to do that, to make this vow and to fail to carry that vow out to its completion is, to use Solomon's phrase here, to make your mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Your mouth has led the rest of you into sin. In other words, don't make promises you're unwilling or unable to keep, because to do so shows a lack of the fear of God. That's the conclusion that he comes to at the end of verse 7. And so Solomon's advice, and kind of the thrust of this whole, at least the first 7 verses, is found at the end of verse 2, which is to let thy words be few. Now, what he means by that is not just, just don't speak a lot, but be mindful of the things you speak, right? Don't just open your mouth and just let whatever come out. Open your mouth with the intention of making sure that the words you're saying are not only meaningful but honest, right? They're weighty and true. James says it this way: let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak, right? And again, this is doubly true with regards to our worship and regards to the things we're saying to God or to our brothers and sisters in Christ. Because with regards to the vow, you say, what's the practical implication here? Maybe we promise, somebody that will help them in one regard, or maybe it's something as simple as somebody asks for a prayer request and we say, hey, I'll pray for you. Well, actually pray for them. Don't just let that be empty, vain words. Don't let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. And then before we move, I just want to make this note, because this is kind of an important context here. In verse 1, it says, keep thy foot when you go to the house of God. In other words, Solomon never once here commands worship. Worship was assumed. It was assumed that everybody was worshiping. And so consistent with the Old and New Testament alike is the built-in assumption that people are worshiping. We don't need the command, because it is the assumption that the people of God are worshiping God. And so this is Solomon's working assumption here in chapter 5. When you go to the house of God, make sure you're doing these things. And so then in verses 8 and 9, now verses 8 and 9 are kind of difficult, 9 in particular. But there's not a whole lot in verses 8 and 9 that follow from the first 7. There's a little bit you can see as far as a continuation of the rest of the chapter, but they kind of stand alone. And include verse 9 with the rest of the chapter, but they really seem to be together in this. And so he takes then a brief look at the unjust nature of world governments. And so verse 8, if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, he says this, marvel not at the matter. Not to say that we shouldn't be disturbed by the obvious lack of justice, the obvious lack of morality with regards to governments and the oppression, and we talk all the time about just how evil our particular government is, about the nature of these things, how people gather power and then that power leads them into doing things that they might not have done otherwise. But Solomon here, he says, marvel not. In other words, it shouldn't be a surprise to us. It shouldn't be a shocking thing to us that sinful humans who have gathered the kind of ultimate power with regards to authority over others, that they would take that and that they would use that as a means to not only gain more power, but to oppress those without. That's kind of the natural end of sinful humanity. So again, if we see oppression, which oppression has always existed, will always exist until Christ returns. And so when we see oppression taking place, marvel not. We shouldn't be surprised, for in the day-to-day life of any individual, we are far removed, and this is the point he's making, we are far removed from those who are the actual authorities. This is what he's talking about in the second half of verse 8. He says, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. He's not talking about, God standing over everybody else, and he will judge one day, although that's true. What he's talking about is the reason why oppression takes place is because typically those in power have separated themselves so much from the common man, you might say, or another way to say it is those who are making the rules are so far removed from the ones who the rules apply to that they don't honestly care if it's oppressing them, right? And again, one has to just take just a few seconds and to look at our own government and to see the truth of this matter, right? The congressmen and women in D.C. do not really give a care about the people for whom they're making the rules. They don't care about them. They're so far removed from that. They live in their ivory towers with their armed guards. They don't care about those for whom they have been voted to protect. They don't care. They're so far removed from it all. And so Solomon says here, again, first of all, this is how it's always been. And second of all, it shouldn't be surprising to us that that kind of thing happens. I'll quote Kidner here. He says, true to the standpoint of the book, the comment of all this is dry and realistic. After all, if we are looking at the world on its own terms of thoroughgoing secularism, which, that's kind of been the case for the whole book, we cannot expect too high a moral tone, either from the system we find in force or from any other. For all his hatred of injustice, Kohelet pins no hopes on utopian schemes or on revolution. He knows what is in human beings. In other words, he's not calling for uprisings. He's not calling for us to overrun them. He just says this is how things are. And then that kind of leads us to verse 9. And like I said, verse 9 is very, very difficult. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. The interpretations of verse 9 are all over the place. There are so many interpretations of verse number 9. And it wouldn't do us well to even talk about half of them. But I think there are two of note. Okay, so the two of note that I will bring to you tonight are, one, either Solomon is saying here that that God cares even for the oppressed, which is true. And so, in other words, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. The same field that serves the common man is the same field that serves the king. And so even though they may gain all this power and authority on the earth, they're still dependent upon the very things that you and I are dependent upon. And this is kind of God's way of almost kind of leveling the playing field, as it were, a little bit. And so there's that interpretation. But there's another interpretation, which is that government, with all of its natural flaws, is better than anarchy, which is also true. And so that government there is no perfect government outside of an actual theocracy, right? A theocratic kingdom where Christ himself is reigning is the only perfect government. Anything outside of that is going to have flaws. It's going to be run in some way, shape, or form by sinful humans. But in spite of that, some form of government is better than absolute anarchy, where people can just go out on the streets and do whatever they want and get away with it. Now, I know that might bring to thought, well, that's what those in the positions of power are doing. They're doing whatever they want. They're getting away with it. To a degree, that's true. But again, at the end of the day, they will stand before their judge one day. But like I said, verses 8 and 9, they're very, very difficult. But at the end of the day, what do we see from this? We see, don't be shocked. Don't be in this state of surprise that sinful men wind up in control over sinful governments. This is almost what should be expected when we consider the sinful nature that is in all of us. And then that sort of flows into the next thought. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of connection between this and the rest of the chapter, but maybe a little bit, because Solomon will then kind of flow into a discussion of riches and labor. Riches and labor. And so verse 10, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, save in the beholding of them with their eyes? To sleep of a laboring man, or rather the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. And so there's some very practical truisms to be found in these few verses. And so he starts with the basic truth that those with the love of money are never actually satisfied by the having of money. It's this interesting irony that exists within the ultra rich, those who are in pursuit of jobs and things like that for the purposes of making money. I do believe that there are some out there who are ultra rich, and they're driven to their jobs not because of the money and the increase that they're getting, but for other reasons. But for the most part, those people who are ultra rich, they do what they do to make riches. And we've talked about this at length in the past. Riches are never enough. Enough is never enough, right? They have some of these guys have they call generational wealth, right? Not just 1 or 2 or 3, but multi-generations down to their 10th and 20th and 40th, great. The kind of money that they have, it's unspeakable, and it will go on and on and on. But even they will say it's not enough, right? I need more. And so they're never satisfied. And that's the point that he makes there in verse 10. And then he goes on, and this is another interesting thing. Verse 11, he says, when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. This is an interesting thing. You kind of, for me at least, the picture that pops into my mind is those people who, have some kind of windfall, the lottery or something like that, and then all of a sudden, what happens? People are coming out of the woodworks, and all of a sudden you have more relatives than you ever knew you had. You have more friends than you ever knew you had. And so I love when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And then, not only that, but verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sleep. Doesn't matter if he has a lot or doesn't matter if he has little, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. And so riches not only invite mouths to feed, but they invite burdens to bear. And so no one has more relatives, no one has more friends, quote unquote, than the rich man. And also the sleep of the lowly is better than the restlessness of the rich, right? It invites stress and burdens that those of us who don't have riches can't even really comprehend. And so it's not all great on the side of the rich. And then he presents kind of this illustration, I guess we'll call it, in verse 13. He says, there is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt, but those riches perish by evil travail. And so he gives this kind of extreme example of somebody who had worked their way to the top and had gained all of these riches, and then something, he doesn't tell us what, but then something happens and those riches are gone. That they perish by evil travail. Something happens and they've just lost everything. And so for this particular man, this man now has nothing to offer his son. He has nothing to offer to those who are, inviting the mouths to feed. He has nothing to offer them. He's going to take nothing with him to the grave, just like he will take to the grave exactly what he brought from the womb, which is nothing. And so all of this illustration leads Solomon to say, all his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath in his sickness. Now, he's using an extreme example because obviously it's something that does happen, but obviously more often than not, the ultra-rich don't lose their riches overnight. That does happen, but that may be not the most common thing. And so he's using an extreme example to prove a point, which is working for the right reasons. Working to gain is not a bad thing. Working only for the purposes of gaining and heaping up treasures upon treasures for the sake of having treasures upon treasures is not a good thing. Having money is not an evil. Loving money is the evil. And so we have to have, priorities. I like the way that Constable says. He says, striving to hoard the fruits of labor is futile, because any misfortune can overtake one and reduce him or her to poverty if God allows it. And that's the key phrase, if God allows it. And we'll come back to that thought in just a second. Peter Pett, he said, so wealth is not necessarily the road to contentment and well-being. It can bring as many problems as it solves, and yet all crave wealth to their hurt. And so this is kind of the point that Solomon is making with this illustration. And then it leads him to verse 18. It says, behold that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun. Why? He says, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Same thing in verse 19. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. And so in contrast to the miserable rich man that he gave in the illustration, is the simple, everyday, common man who simply enjoys the fruit of his labor. Why? Because that man understands where it comes from. And so ultimately it is God who gives, just like Job says. It is God who gives, and it is God who takes away, right? And then what did he say? Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so it is God who gives, it is God who takes away. The man who has joy is the man who understands this. And it doesn't matter if that man is poor, it doesn't matter if that man is rich, the middle class that we talk about all the time. It doesn't matter what their societal standing is. The man who has joy is the man who understands where those good gifts come from. And when you understand where those good gifts come from and can give glory to God for the gifts that you have, right, that's when joy comes into play. And so one more from Kidner. He says, once more a positive note has broken through, and as the chapter ends, we catch a glimpse of the person for whom life passes swiftly, not because it is short and meaningless, but because by the grace of God, he or she finds it utterly absorbing. And this is verse 20. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. In other words, life has passed this man by, not because he's sad, not because he's miserable, not because he's just down in the dumps, but because he has so much enjoyed and taken joy in the things of God and in the gifts of God that it's just like life has just flown by because he's just been enjoying every minute of it, giving praise to God the whole time. And so, this is this chapter, I think, and particularly the end, is a good example of, we talked at the very beginning of the introduction, a lot of people see the book of Ecclesiastes as a very kind of depressing almost book. But that's not the point that Solomon is making. And when we understand why he's saying the things that he's saying, and actually understanding his conclusions, we see that it's not a depressing, but it's a hopeful book. It's a hopeful book. It gives hope to the reason and hope to why some things happen in this world, why sometimes bad things happen in this world, and what can we do in those, and when we come to the conclusion that God is over all, and in that we can have joy, we understand that it is not a depressing book. It is a hope-filled book. We talked about last week or 2 weeks ago having a beyond the sun mindset while we're living under the sun. Right? That's key in the book of Ecclesiastes. So some more really, really practical and good truth from Solomon here in the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay, couple